Ladies and gentlemen, we have a Hall of Famer.
Your Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
And welcome into this Tuesday, June 28th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. I'm Armando Velez from PantherParkway.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at MondoMan12. Follow the show account on Twitter at LO_FLA Panthers. And thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. Don't forget to also subscribe to Locked On NHL and the Crosscheck NHL show with Andrew Berkshire and Mary Clark, who will be covering all the off-season activities around the National Hockey League. So, ladies and gentlemen, like I spoke about at the top of the show, the Florida Panthers have a Hall of Famer. Yesterday, Monday, around 3 p.m., it was in the Hockey Hall of Fame announced that Roberto Luongo, in his first year on the ballot to be elected to the Hall of Fame, and what an incredible career that we as Panther fans got to know already for Roberto Luongo as a guy who was second most in games played, fourth most wins all time, ninth most in shutouts in NHL history. And this was a guy who had multiple years in Sunrise, Florida. His first 317 games with the Panthers before he got traded to the Vancouver Canucks, and then the last 255 when he got traded back. But let's talk about the story of Roberto Luongo. Originally drafted by the New York Islanders and then traded in June 24th of 2000. And along with that trade with Roberto Luongo was a guy by the name of Olli Jokinen. I'm sure a lot of you Florida Panther fans know about Olli Jokinen. And the trade was for right winger Mark Parrish and left winger Oleg Kovasha. So there was a little bit of a spark that needed for this Florida Panthers team. This Panthers team was just coming off a first round sweep of the New Jersey Devils. They trade for Pavel Bure just the season before after he held out of Vancouver, really forcing himself out of Vancouver. But during Roberto Luongo's first stint with the Florida Panthers, which was from the 2000-2001 season all the way from 2005 to 2006, before he got traded in that offseason to the Vancouver Canucks, Roberto Luongo and the rest of the Florida Panthers were kind of set up to lose. And in that way, with 5 different head coaches, some of those head coaches were the GMs. Let's go over it real quick. Terry Murphy, coached for 36 games before he eventually got fired. And then interim head coach Dwayne Sutter coached for the other 72 games. If you hear Sutter and you hear Dwayne Sutter, yep, that is the brother of Calgary Flames head coach Daryl Sutter. Then Mike Keenan comes into play, coaches the next 3 seasons for the Florida Panthers, then resigns from his positions, assuming GM duties. Rick Dudley steps in for 40 games, and then Mike Keenan is the one who makes that trade for Roberto Luongo to the Vancouver Canucks. But let's rewind before the trade for that Roberto Luongo sending him to the Vancouver Canucks before Mike Keenan eventually makes that move. During that time with the Florida Panthers and Roberto Luongo, this team was 3rd worst record in the NHL, 3rd worst scoring, 3rd worst power play, 7th worst in goals against. That includes both goalies and empty net goals. PK percentage was 22nd in the NHL. But there was also hope with this team as well. Of course, Olli Jokinen's part of the trade, like we talked about. Pavel Bure was part of the team. He was scoring in the high 50s as far as goals in his season, and still the Florida Panthers just couldn't get over just not making the playoffs just only that one time. And even though he scored 50 in the high 50s, the Florida Panthers still couldn't advance past the first round, not even winning a single playoff game. Stephen Weiss was drafted with the Florida Panthers, 4th overall in 2001. The Florida Panthers had multiple cracks at the number 1 overall pick in the draft lottery as well. In 2002, eventually fell down to number 3 overall pick, eventually drafting Jay Bullmeister. Rick Nash was eventually number 1 overall in that one. And then 2003 as well, the Marc-Andre Fleury draft, where they slotted to number 3, drafting Nathan Horton. And of course, that was also the time where the Florida Panthers were trying to get Alex Ovechkin to be part of the 2003 draft due to the age eligibility as well, trying to get him in that one so they could select him. Eventually, Alex Ovechkin, as we know, goes number 1 overall to the Washington Capitals in the very next season. And the Florida Panthers as well, they were going through an ownership change as well. Wayne Huizenga was just on the verge of selling the team to Alan Cohen, and there was a lot of dysfunction there, with GMs also being coaches as well, like we spoke about earlier. And the hope for the Florida Panthers having all this draft capital and just not it coming to fruition, and not getting that goal support that Roberto Luongo needed when he was with the Florida Panthers the first time. And what did that result in? No playoff appearances, unfortunately. And let's just talk about some of his career accolades too. We mentioned on the NHL level, but we also talk about Panthers levels as well. Most wins, even though I don't really subscribe to goalie wins as a stat, but we'll just do it for this sake of the exercise in this episode. 230 wins, 38 total shutouts in Florida Panthers history, most saves, most points by a goalie, even though that's I guess that's a stat, but 13 points for a goalie. All assists, 75 games played in a season, most in a season. And then his 2004 season, most 7 shutouts in that season alone, gets 3rd in the Vezina trophy voting, behind Martin Brodeur in that season. 3 times in his career, he's been a Vezina Trophy finalist, twice with the Vancouver Canucks, which was weird. In his time in Vancouver, he got 2nd in Vezina Trophy voting behind Martin Brodeur, but then ahead of Martin Brodeur in Hart voting, but behind Sidney Crosby in 2007. Not going to take away anything from Sidney Crosby as far as the Hart, but it's just kind of weird based on he was ahead of Brodeur in one category, but behind him in another category. So it was painful seeing Roberto Luongo traded. I mean, I didn't live in that time when he was eventually traded, but talking about the overall Florida Panther perspective, but based on the history of this team, and of course, speaking with fans who have been around longer than I have, speaking to them. And of course, what did we see when the Florida Panthers traded Roberto Luongo to the Vancouver Canucks? We saw 6 playoff appearances for that same Vancouver Canucks team, which also resulted in a Stanley Cup Final appearance. And of course, the 4th all-time winner in NHL history as far as goalies. He was able to help the Vancouver Canucks get to that Stanley Cup Final. Like we said, he was a Vezina Trophy finalist twice while he was in Vancouver, once in Florida. And that 2011 playoffs for Roberto Luongo, .914 save percentage, and helped a lot with the scoring by the 2 Sedin brothers, who are also in the same class as Roberto Luongo in this Hall of Fame class. Let's read a little bit of the class for the 2022 Hockey Hall of Fame. Henrik Sedin, Daniel Sedin, Riikka Salonen, who's a women's hockey player from Finland, Roberto Luongo, who we just named, Daniel Alfredsson, former captain of the Ottawa Senators, and Herb Carnegie, who didn't play in the NHL but was denied playing in the NHL due to his skin color. So he was a trailblazer for hockey players up in Canada as well. So he's one of the he's a player who's really, as far as minority hockey players, he's up there with the Willie O'Rees as far as popularity, and now he is a Hall of Famer. But we're going to talk a little bit more about Roberto Luongo. We saw we saw a lot of us who are on the older side of being Panther fans. A lot of them saw how Roberto Luongo, as successful as he was personally, a lot of times he got the short end of the stick as far as team success. A lot of that happened in the his first stint with the Florida Panthers, and a lot of that happened in the second stint as well for the Cats as well. But we're going to talk about that more in the next segment here on Locked On Panthers. But first, we're going to tell you all about BetOnline. And BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your sports betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports development, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs and Major League Baseball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check on all the favorite sports events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Second segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. I'm Armando Velez, a solo episode today as we are discussing Roberto Luongo being inducted, first ballot Hall of Famer, playing 572 games for the Panthers in his career, a total of 230 wins, 241 losses, and 73 ties/overtime losses, which, again, I'm not a big subscriber of goalie wins being a stat. You see more losses there, but as far as the play on the ice, you put a better team around Roberto Luongo. You are, I bet that he's at least second all time in wins, behind Martin Brodeur. Had he had more team success around him. And let's go back to the Stanley Cup Final as well. What we talked about, the Sedin brothers, and the fact that he was in that same season that he was a Vezina finalist. He eventually met up in the Stanley Cup Final with the Vezina Trophy winner of that year in Tim Thomas. And Tim Thomas was just the better goalie in that one. 940 save percentage for Tim Thomas in that Stanley Cup Final, while Roberto Luongo's was a 914, taking it all the way to a Game 7, unfortunately losing on home ice in that 2011 playoff series. But in the middle of the trade deadline in 2014, the Florida Panthers bring Luongo back to Florida. It's funny because Tim Thomas was with the Florida Panthers at that time. Not the same Tim Thomas that we saw in that Stanley Cup Final versus Roberto Luongo. But hey, the Florida Panthers were also in that transition of being sold again, this time to the current owner that we have here in Vinny Viola. And this was the time where Huberdeau was drafted, Barkov was drafted, and then Viola makes his first ever selection as owner of the Panthers with Aaron Ekblad. But this time around, for the hockey legend, we knew he was a legend, but now we can call him Hall of Famer Roberto Luongo. He didn't have as many coaches this time around with Peter Horachek. Finished the season that when Roberto Luongo was traded back to the Florida Panthers. Gerard Gallant is at the helm for a few seasons before another GM takes over as the head coach in Tom Rowe. And then, of course, the Bugner years, which were years of playing a lot of catch up. And then that was the time where Roberto Luongo's body was just starting to give up on him. And of course, the great play that we saw, Roberto Luongo just making save after save. And unfortunately, his hip gave out and the injuries caught up to him. And of course, it was the proper transition at the time from Roberto Luongo to Sergei Bobrovsky. Of course, we can argue about that cap hit. But today's not the day to argue about that cap hit when it comes to Sergei Bobrovsky. We're talking about Luongo today, and of course, Luongo, a big part of that 12-game winning streak for the Panthers in 2016 that helped them to get the division title. And my goodness, the one and only playoff appearance that the Florida Panthers had with Roberto Luongo as their goalie, he was the MVP of that series because the scoring disappeared for the Florida Panthers. Yeah, they traded for Jaromir Jagr the season before, but Jagr was in the middle of a 30-plus game goalless streak at that time. Sure, he was in his early 40s. I believe it was 43 at the time. It was quite a long time ago. But you look, let's talk about the leading scorers for the Panthers in that Islanders series. Riley Smith doubled the amount of points of anyone else in that 2016 playoff series with 8 points. And then there's 4 players tied for 4, and none of them were Barkov. None of them were Huberdeau. None of them were Ekblad. None of them were Jaromir Jagr. Here are the names: Nick Bjugstad, Alex Petrovich, however you pronounce it, Dmitry Kulikov, and UC Jokinen with 4. The rest of the guys did not help Roberto Luongo out. And of course, this was still a core with this Florida Panthers team. Sure, they were still young, but they were not helping their goaltender out during that series. And I mean, just look at that postseason alone, just reading Roberto Luongo's numbers to back it up. 934 save percentage in that 2016 series, 2.05 goals against average, and the Florida Panthers on the power play. Let's talk about the power play. Vincent Trocheck was a non-factor neither in that series. 13.3% on the power play. You had 3 different chances in 3 different overtime games for the Panthers. They couldn't win either of them. The Islanders got the best of them. John Tavares got the best of them. Thomas Greiss, who was the backup of the New York Islanders, got the best of the Panthers. They thought it was going to be a cakewalk going against a backup goaltender. And Thomas Greiss just ate their money, and so did John Tavares and company as well. So Luongo, as great as accomplishments this is for Roberto Luongo, this almost sounds like a Roberto Luongo apologist episode of Locked On Panthers, because the greatness that Roberto Luongo had, he always gave the Florida Panthers a chance. At least most nights he gave the Florida Panthers a chance. But the Florida Panthers didn't do him really any favors back in the scoring department. We read some of the scoring for the Florida Panthers in his first stints, as they were near the bottom. And they were kind of near the bottom as well. They were just with getting 3 top 3 picks in a short span. Of course, he came towards the latter part of the Panthers trying to draft and develop the core 3 that we have today. But still, as far as them breaking out, it hadn't happened yet until later on, more like after Jaromir Jagr left. It was more like in Roberto Luongo's last season with the Panthers. That's when the offense was really starting to get it together. But by the time the Florida Panthers core was starting to get it together, like we talked about, Roberto Luongo's hip just said no. And that's the really difficult part about Roberto Luongo's career with the Florida Panthers, is you feel like there's a lot of meat left on the bone, and a lot of it was just out of Luongo's control as well. That's how great Roberto Luongo is when you speak about him, because he gave the Panthers a chance most nights. So with the records that, despite so much losing, and the fact that he has the records that he has, and of course, let's not forget he spent 8 years with the Vancouver Canucks, and a lot of those teams were successful. 6 out of his 8 years were there, but it just goes to show how the Panthers kind of misused him, especially in his mid years, which were his prime years. That was those Canucks years were his prime years, and it felt like the Florida Panthers, from their perspective, the fan perspective, felt like as if they were robbed at that time. And of course, the Florida Panthers, like we talked about, the Panthers, to get him back, had to trade now we have in the league now a seasoned goaltender in Jacob Markstrom as part of that trade. And so now with the Panthers and Roberto Luongo, now that they brought him back in the front office, now it's been a few years that he's been there. There was rumors that he was going to be the GM of the Montreal Canadiens after Marc Bergevin was fired. It was a chance that Roberto Luongo could have gone back to his native home of Quebec. And class move by the Florida Panthers to retire his jersey number against his hometown team, Montreal Canadiens, so that it could be televised in Canadian television as well. But I just spent 20 minutes talking about Roberto Luongo's hockey career. But the number one moment that Roberto Luongo had as the most impactful moment that he had was the day after the Parkland shooting of a day I'll never forget, February 14, 2018, where innocent lives were killed in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Weirdly, Roberto Luongo and the Florida Panthers happened to be in Vancouver against his former team. The Panthers didn't return home until the next week. I believe it was 10 days later. Don't quote me on that. And then Luongo, the heart and soul of this team, a guy who's been with this franchise for so many years, even though it was 2 different stints, let out a very powerful, emotional speech. Though the speech itself doesn't necessarily bring the lives back of those 18 who were killed, that was, at the time, a voice of hope and a voice of inspiration that we could get behind at the time. And I had the opportunity to meet Roberto Luongo just last November in a Panthers versus Tampa Bay Lightning game at Amalie Arena, which the Florida Panthers lost in overtime. And during one of the intermissions, just walking towards the bathroom, I told this story on the February 14th episode of Locked On Panthers, just talk about Parkland. And once again, I want to rehash this. I spoke to Roberto Luongo. It was about a 30-second to a minute conversation. That's it. I did not mention a single word to him about hockey. I mentioned to Roberto Luongo about that speech. And to me, that was the personal right thing to do when it comes to thanking him for who he is as a human being. And he's a resident of Parkland. He raised his family in Parkland, Florida, which makes it more of how we can connect to him as a person of our community, the 954, 305, 561 area of South Florida, that we connect with him, and that he was able to connect and sympathize with all those people and families who lost loved ones on that day of February 14, 2018. That itself is my favorite moment when it comes to Roberto Luongo. Unfortunately, that favorite moment came in tragedy, but it is a moment that we Panther fans should never forget, as far as when the Florida Panthers, right before they were taking the ice against the Washington Capitals at the time when it was called BB&T Center. So Roberto Luongo, not only congratulations, a public congratulations from Locked On Panthers to you on being first ballot Hall of Famer, to spend a majority of your career with the Florida Panthers and the impact you have made on the ice. I'm sure I'm missing a few things more of what to talk about to Roberto Luongo about all his accolades. But the fact that he's been able to make an impact on this franchise on and off the ice, because remember, he's part of the goalie excellence department as well with this franchise as well. So he is definitely making that impact He's continuously doing that as part of this Florida Panthers franchise along with their front office. So Roberto Luongo, first ballot Hall of Famer, congratulations. And I can't wait for you to officially be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. In the next segment, we're going to be discussing the wrap-up of the Stanley Cup Final, as the Colorado Avalanche are Stanley Cup champions. We're going to discuss that next on this June 28th edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Third and final segment here on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast on this Tuesday, June 28th, 2022. We just spoke about Roberto Luongo becoming a first ballot Hall of Famer, elected into the Hall of Fame. Now we wait a few months until he is officially inducted up in Toronto. So let's talk about the Stanley Cup Final. Of course, the Stanley Cup Final Game 5 happened on Friday night, so we didn't have a chance to talk about Game 5 of the final. And I'll say, Game 5, when the Tampa Bay Lightning won, I said to myself, "Oh no, the Tampa Bay Lightning have a pulse." And despite 37 shots on goal, we saw who the better goalie was at that point, and that was a game all in itself about Vasilevsky showing why he is the best goalie in the world. And of course, Darcy Kemper gave up a not so good goal on Jan Ruda for the first goal of the game. Valeri Nichushkin, even though he, after the Stanley Cup Final, he showed a picture of his foot, of what his injury, what it really looked like, and doesn't look too good. And even though Nikita Kucherov was very quiet mostly in the Stanley Cup Final, he was able to get a power play goal. And Cale Makar added to his Conn Smythe voting, which he eventually won. And Palat, he's gonna definitely earn his payday for this upcoming offseason. It's gonna be a difficult job for Julien Brisebois to get him under the cap after the flat cap that's been going on for the last few years. But let's get to Game 6 because before I was predicting that the Colorado Avalanche were going to win Game 5, win the cup at home. But the moment the Tampa Bay Lightning won Game 5, I thought they were going to win Game 6 as well. And they get a penalty within the first few minutes of the game. They don't score after that. But hey, Steven Stamkos, if the Tampa Bay Lightning were to win the Stanley Cup for a third straight year, Stamkos would probably been my Conn Smythe winner for the Tampa Bay Lightning. But Nick McKinnon, he had a hard time going in the Stanley Cup Final. It was mostly carried by Cale Makar. The Gabriel Anderskog was part of the power play that was getting goals for the Colorado Avalanche. And really, Nathan McKinnon was really quiet for the beginning of this series. And even the Tampa Bay Lightning, they were starting to slow down the power play of the Colorado Avalanche in the latter part of the series. They weren't getting power play goals at will like they were in the first part of the series. So Vasilevsky was keeping the Tampa Bay Lightning in this one for the most part. And crazy because McKinnon scores on a sharp angle shot to get one past Vasilevsky, and then Arturi Lehkonen, who got the game winner in the previous round, and then gets a goal in last year to help the Montreal Canadiens advance to the Stanley Cup Final against the Tampa Bay Lightning. And Arturi Lehkonen does it again for three times in the last 2 years. He gets one, just scores clutch goals for the Tampa Bay Lightning. But really, the Tampa Bay Lightning looked tired towards the end. Braden Point, they gave it a try for him to play, but it just and it didn't feel like that the Tampa Bay Lightning were even rushing him back. But apparently he wasn't ready, and it was too much to overcome for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Nazem Kadri, let's talk about him real quick. Originally, what was supposed to be a 6-week injury, and he played 2 weeks after that supposed 6-week injury. And of course, there was a quote on Sportsnet about people doubting him, and it was just a beautiful quote. This is a family-friendly show, so any language related to that, go look it up yourself if you want to look up Nazem Kadri's quote post game after winning the Stanley Cup. You talk about players who have been there for a long time for the Colorado Avalanche. You talk about a former number 1 overall pick in Eric Johnson he was with the St. Louis Blues, longest tenured Avalanche player there. All the Avalanche players talking great about Andrew Cogliano as well, trying to get him a cup. Gabriel Anderskog, a former second overall pick, right? The pick right before Jonathan Huberdeau in 2011, the captain of the team, who there was a little bit of a dispute related to his contract on whether he was going to come back or not last offseason. And then, Joe Sakic, he's not the type of guy who gives long-term contracts to players after 30. So that also means that there's a chance that Nazem Kadri won't return to the Colorado Avalanche. So this was their time to win, and they found a way to win it. And also, like we talked about, drafting Nathan MacKinnon first overall, and he can eat a carb now that he won a Stanley Cup. So, and then of course not really mid, it's still a lottery pick, but not early in the draft with Mikko Rantanen as well. And then you think about, for the Colorado Avalanche, Patrick Waugh walks away before the season starts. They had to get a guy who won at the ECHL level, won at the AHL level. The ECHL level was with the South Carolina Stingrays, Washington Capitals affiliate, and then Lake Erie Monsters, who was now the Cleveland Monsters, who was part of the Columbus Blue Jackets affiliate. They had to get this guy named Jared Bednar. And then after getting 47 points in 2017, not the best position to be in if you're the Colorado Avalanche. A lot of people probably questioning the core of the team at the time. Matt Duchene gets traded to Ottawa Senators, and then there's some luck in that too. It ends up being the 4th overall pick. Excuse me. And though Bo Byram has struggled with his fair share of injuries throughout his career, he panned out as a pretty solid mid-pairing defenseman as well. They trade for Devon Toews from the New York Islanders for a bag of chips, and he's part of the top line with Cale Makar. And Cale Makar, let's talk about Cale Makar's accolades. Hobey Baker winner, Norris Trophy winner now, Conn Smythe winner, Calder Trophy winner. This guy's 23 years old. There's a reason why people like Wayne Gretzky was talking about Cale Makar, comparing him to people like Bobby Orr, Paul Coffey, Chris Chelios, talking about all those comparisons to those players in as far as some of the best in history. And Cale Makar, he's just getting started at his age of 23. And 4th overall, and there's a quote about Nathan MacKinnon talking about how we spoke about it with Jacob, and talking about how those Alberta Junior Hockey League players are not so good. And it's funny because Cale Makar, in his NHL debut, was in the playoffs for the Avalanche, and he scored in his very first goal against his hometown team of Calgary. You can't write a better script like that for Cale Makar's career. And Gabriel Anderskog even said, how do you get to a level like this? You draft somebody like Cale Makar. That's how great this dude is. And, maybe if he slipped 6 more spots, the Florida Panthers could have been lucky. That was the Owen Tippett draft. So, but not so lucky for the Florida Panthers. And let's talk a little bit about the Tampa Bay Lightning and go back to them a little bit. Some of the calls for Tampa Bay, the boarding call for Ryan McDonough on Darren Helm. Also, congratulations, Darren Helm won a Stanley Cup in his first season with Detroit. Goes back to the AHL the very next season, and then took a little bit of time to win another Stanley Cup. But Ryan McDonough, another boarding call. We Florida Panthers are very familiar with that based on last year's first-round series against Tampa Bay, where he boarded Anthony Duclair. Jacob and I were at the game. We were upset as can be about that. Nikita Kucherov breaks his stick, tries to get another one in the final 30 seconds in a 2-1 game at home, and just unable to get a stick, and apparently throws it at a Lightning equipment person. The final buzzer sounds. Victor Hedman going after the refs. Pat Maroon, after a goal by Nathan MacKinnon, or the Arturi Lankinen goal, goes after Josh Manson. what a great pickup by Joe Sakic, by the way. Josh Manson from the Anaheim Ducks goes after him, and Josh Manson sees the hit coming. And I'm just a little livid thinking, why isn't Pat Maroon getting on Sportsmanlike for that? But of course, it's the playoffs. Less penalties are called during that part of the season. I mean, there's only 2 penalties in the whole game for Game 6. But people talk about why are the Tampa Bay Lightning this upset about losing a Stanley Cup, and shouldn't they be grateful and because they won too? I mean, you put all that in the past and you're worried about the present moment. So if you're them, of course you're mad. Of course. You don't want to lose at any point. And of course, the only one person that I really legitimately feel extremely bad for is someone like Corey Perry. 2 years ago with the Stars, loses against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Montreal Canadiens facing off against the Tampa Bay Lightning, and then joining the Tampa Bay Lightning, he loses another one. At this point, I think Corey Perry could sign with the Colorado Avalanche. And jokingly, the Locked On NHL Twitter page was talking about Corey Perry's luck, and I quote tweeted jokingly saying, "Don't even think about it, Bill Zito." As far as the luck when it comes to Corey Perry and his Stanley Cup luck as of late. I mean, Marian Hossa back in the late 2000s eventually got his with the Chicago Blackhawks after failing with Pittsburgh and Detroit in the late 2000s. But hey, in all seriousness, I take a Corey Perry on my team. He's a grinder and he's a leader. But of course, the Florida Panthers, he's likely looking for a 1-year deal. And I don't know what the cap hit looks like for the Florida Panthers to try to pay someone like Corey Perry. So I don't know if that is possible. I mean, priority number 1 is Claude Giroux to try to re-sign. But as far as that for Corey Perry, the really only person I feel bad for. And listen, 16-4 for the Colorado Avalanche. They only lost 1 road game this entire playoffs, and it was Game 3 against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Most of their challenges came from home, weirdly, and they were still 16-4. All the small things playing in Ball Arena and it ringing all over that arena. And of course, it wouldn't be talking about the Colorado Avalanche and them winning the Stanley Cup Final before me mentioning that the whole whoop whoop that they say at Ball Arena really got stuck in my head. I'm sure it did for a lot of you guys too. After they scored a goal, you just wanted to yell it back at the TV, even though you're not even though neither of you listening to this are an Avs fan, unless an Avs fan happens to download this episode of Locked On Panthers. But great season by the Colorado Avalanche, and I want to leave with one thing before we wrap up, and little tease to tomorrow's episode of Locked On Panthers is this run by the Colorado Avalanche of them falling short so many times in the last few years, them building the team to what it is today and falling short, is that hope? Does that give you, the Florida Panthers fan, hope that this could eventually be them? I will give my answer tomorrow on the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, because tomorrow's episode of Locked On Panthers, we will be bringing in Jacob Winans of PantherParkway.com for a Winans Wednesday edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. We're going to be answering that question about how we think about that question that I just asked you. And before you go into Wednesday's episode of Locked On Panthers, think about it. But you could also tweet at me at MondoMan12, at LO_FLA Panthers, and answer that question yourself. Does it give you hope that the Florida Panthers could be that team to next hoist the Stanley Cup? We'll talk about that more on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast. But in the meantime, if you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the podcast to be notified every single time the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast jumps into your podcast feed. Don't forget to also subscribe to the Crosscheck NHL show and Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast will be covering all the off-season activities around the National Hockey League. Thank you for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast your first listen of the day. And for your second listen of the day, make sure to listen to today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Hockey. From each round to the Stanley Cup kiss to now every offseason move that teams are anticipated to make, Locked On NHL is your one-stop shop for all things NHL. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. So I'm Armando Velez, signing off. And you've been listening to Locked On Florida Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day.